She just wanted to invite a kind person to her party, but no one expected how it would turn out, especially her mother. Subscribe and post in the comments where you're watching this video from. In the pristine suburb of Belleview, everything seemed carefully constructed to maintain an illusion of perfection. The streets stretched clean and orderly, lined with identical houses painted in tasteful shades of cream and gray. The lawns were immaculately trimmed, edged with neat rows of white roses and hydrangeas. Driveways shimmered in the afternoon sun, boasting sleek cars that seemed polished daily. The sidewalks were wide and empty, designed more for show than for the use of pedestrians, and the people who lived behind those carefully manicured hedges moved through life with the same polished sterility as their homes. Behind the closed doors of these pristine homes were families who prided themselves on being decent people. They smiled politely at one another, hosted elegant garden parties, and exchanged carefully measured compliments about their children's achievements or the success of their latest investments. But beneath those smiles lay an unspoken understanding, a rigid boundary of class, status, and appearance that no one dared cross. The rules were not written, but well understood, who belonged and who did not. Those who lived outside the invisible line drawn around Bellevue were to be tolerated at best and ignored at worst, but never welcomed. Lily Hudson had grown up within these walls of silent expectation. She was 8 years old, with a crown of pale blonde curls and clear blue eyes that made the neighbors sigh and comment on what a perfect little angel she was. She moved gracefully, spoke quietly, and always said please and thank you, like a well-trained child of a well-bred family. Her mother, Margaret Hudson, had ensured that her daughter would be an exemplary reflection of the Hudson name, a name whispered with admiration at PTA meetings and charity luncheons. Margaret Hudson was a woman who commanded attention without ever raising her voice. She was tall, slim, with porcelain skin that seemed untouched by time or the sun. Every strand of her ash-blonde hair was always perfectly in place, her posture straight, her tone clipped and efficient. Behind the polite smile she wore at social events lay a heart ruled by cold calculation and judgment. Margaret was a master of social hierarchy. She knew exactly who was worth speaking to and who was best ignored. She measured people not by the weight of their kindness, but by the weight of their wallets, the clarity of their speech, and most importantly, the color of their skin. To Margaret, the world was neatly divided into categories. There were the people of Bellevue, the good, proper, successful people, and there were others. The service people, the invisible hands that kept the streets clean and the groceries delivered, the ones who came and went without being seen. She had never voiced her beliefs openly. She didn't need to. Her glances, her silences, her dismissive gestures spoke louder than any words ever could. Lily had been raised in that world of quiet prejudice, but her heart had not yet hardened. There was a softness in her that her mother could not train out of her, no matter how many etiquette lessons she gave. It wasn't that Lily disagreed with her mother. She was too young to even recognize the undercurrents of the world around her, but there was something inside her that questioned, silently, persistently. Every morning, as she sat at the large bay window in the living room, she would watch the same scene unfold. The garbage truck would rumble down their street at precisely 8:30, and two men would move efficiently behind it, lifting heavy bins, emptying them, and placing them back with mechanical precision. Most of the time, Lily barely noticed the driver or the younger man who'd moved quickly and avoided eye contact. But her gaze always found the older man, the one who walked a little slower, who moved with careful dignity even as he collected trash. His name was Marcus. Lily didn't know much about him. She had never spoken to him, nor had she heard anyone mention him by name. To her mother and the neighbors, he was simply the garbage man, not a person but a function, like the lawnmower or the leaf blower. But to Lily, there was something different about him. She noticed how he always greeted their old neighbor, Mrs. Whitmore, with a polite nod when she struggled to carry her groceries. She saw how he picked up litter from the street, even when it wasn't his job, how he once stopped to help a stray cat out of a storm drain. She noticed, too, how no one else ever saw these things. The people of Belleview had mastered the art of looking through Marcus as though he did not exist. No one thanked him. No one smiled at him. Sometimes, when the trash bins were particularly heavy, or when the weather was cruel, Lily would see the exhaustion on his face. But he never stopped. He never scowled. He simply kept working, day after day, as though carrying the weight of an entire town's indifference on his shoulders. Margaret Hudson noticed Lily's interest and did not approve. Once, when she caught her daughter lingering too long by the window, she had remarked casually but coldly, "You shouldn't stare at people like that, darling, especially not at men like him." Lily had turned away without answering. She didn't understand what her mother meant by men like him, but something about the way she said it made her feel small and sad. Days turned into weeks, and the scene repeated itself. The truck would come, the bins would be emptied, the workers would leave, and the neighbors would pretend they had never been there. And every morning, Lily would watch Marcus from her window, quietly wondering about the man everyone refused to see. One afternoon, something unusual happened. Lily sat at the window, her chin resting in her hands, when she saw Marcus stop in front of their house. He bent down, picked up a stray soda can that had rolled under the hedge and carefully placed it in the bin. It was a small gesture, unnoticed by anyone else, but to Lily it felt like a kindness. That night, at dinner, Lily hesitated before speaking. "Mommy," she asked, her voice small, "why don't people ever talk to the garbage men?" Margaret barely glanced up from her glass of wine. "Because there's no reason to, darling. They do their job, we do ours." "But he's always nice," Lily persisted. "He helps people." Margaret's lips tightened. "Lily, some people are meant to do certain things in life. It's not our place to interfere. You should learn not to concern yourself with people beneath you." The words stung, even though Lily didn't fully understand why. Something about them felt wrong, heavy, like a stone pressing against her chest. Later that night, when she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Lily thought about Marcus again. She thought about the way he bent down to pick up that can, how he nodded to Mrs. Whitmore, how he smiled even when no one smiled back. And she wondered why her mother couldn't see what she saw. As spring crept into summer, the preparations for Lily's upcoming birthday began. Margaret spared no expense. There were meetings with caterers, fittings for a custom-made dress, discussions about the guest list and the decorations. Margaret planned the party with military precision, determined to make it the most talked-about event in Belleview's social calendar. Lily watched it all unfold with growing detachment. The more her mother planned, the more Lily felt as though the party wasn't really for her. It was for the neighbors, for appearances, for the unspoken competition that seemed to govern every interaction in Bellevue. One morning, as the garbage truck rumbled down their street and Marcus passed by their house, Lily pressed her hand against the window pane. She didn't know why, but a thought settled quietly in her mind, unshakable and warm, She wanted him at her birthday party. The idea seemed absurd, impossible even, but it rooted itself in her heart like a seed. She didn't care that no one else would approve. She didn't care what her mother would say. She only knew that, somehow, Marcus belonged there more than anyone else. She didn't yet understand that a simple invitation could unravel everything. The shadows of Belleview were about to shift. The days leading up to Lily Hudson's birthday passed in a blur of preparations and restless anticipation. Belleview hummed with a peculiar energy whenever the Hudsons hosted an event, and this party was no exception. Margaret Hudson moved through the house like a general commanding her troops, barking quiet orders to the caterers, florists, and decorators who arrived each morning with boxes and bundles. Every detail had to be perfect. The silk tablecloths imported from Italy, the pastel balloons arranged in tasteful arches, the pristine dessert table adorned with handcrafted sweets no child could pronounce, let alone desire. Margaret had spared no expense. She ordered matching dresses for the children attending, customized party favors monogrammed with Lily's initials, and hired a string quartet to play soft classical music during the luncheon. There would be no clowns or bounce houses, no face painting or magic tricks. This was not a party for children. It was a showcase, an event designed to remind the neighbors of their place on the social ladder, and of Margaret Hudson's perch at the very top. Lily, however, moved through these preparations like a ghost. She nodded politely when asked about her favorite colors, smiled faintly when shown the designer cake, and stood still while the tailor measured her for the delicate white dress her mother insisted she wear, but her thoughts were elsewhere. They drifted back to the man in the green sanitation uniform, to the way he had smiled when he bent to pick up that forgotten soda can, to the way his eyes seemed to hold a quiet kindness no one else in Bellevue ever noticed. Each morning, she watched for him, her little heart tightening with something she couldn't name every time he passed by. It wasn't pity. It wasn't curiosity. It was something softer, something deeper, the simple understanding that Marcus was good, even though everyone around her pretended he wasn't there. The idea that had first taken root in her mind began to bloom. The more the adults around her fussed over china patterns and seating charts, the more certain Lily became of one thing. She wanted Marcus at her party. It wasn't a childish whim, nor an act of rebellion. To her, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. What was a party for, if not for inviting people you liked? One afternoon, as the decorators bustled around the backyard, Margaret sat at the kitchen island, flipping through the finalized guest list on her tablet. Lily lingered nearby, nervously clutching the hem of her dress. "Mommy," she began, her voice small. Margaret didn't look up. "Yes, darling. I was thinking maybe I could invite someone else to the party." Margaret arched a brow without lifting her gaze. "Who?" Lily hesitated, then gathered her courage. "The garbage man, Marcus." The tablet clattered softly as Margaret set it down. Her smile didn't falter, but it froze at the edges, brittle and strained. "Darling," she said sweetly, "that's not the kind of person we invite to events like this." "But why not?" Lily asked quietly. "He's always nice. He helps people." Margaret's smile faded. She sighed, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "Lily, there are certain people who belong in our lives and certain people who do not. It's not appropriate to invite workers to our home. They have their place, and we have ours." Lily's stomach twisted. She wanted to argue, to say that Marcus didn't seem different from anyone else, but the look in her mother's eyes told her the conversation was over. Margaret reached out, smoothing her daughter's hair with mechanical affection before returning to her tablet. Now, go upstairs and finish writing your thank you cards. The guests will expect them." Lily walked away without another word, but her heart burned with quiet determination. She knew her mother wouldn't understand. None of the adults in Bellevue would. But that didn't change how she felt. That night, after the house grew still and the caterers had left, Lily crept from her bed and sat at her small desk by the window. She took a sheet of her fanciest stationery, the one with tiny gold stars along the edges, and wrote carefully in her best handwriting, "Dear Marcus, I would like you to come to my birthday party on Saturday. It would make me very happy if you came. Your friend, Lily Hudson." She folded the note and slipped it into a small pink envelope. In the morning, she tucked it into her pocket before heading downstairs for breakfast. The opportunity came quickly. As she sat in the front room pretending to read, she heard the familiar rumble of the garbage truck approaching. Her heart raced. She waited until she saw Marcus pause at the curb, then darted outside, pretending to check the mailbox. She hurried to the side of the house where the bins sat neatly in a row and tucked the envelope between two trash bags, wedging it securely so it wouldn't fall out. She glanced over her shoulder once, seeing Marcus a few houses down, then scurried back inside before anyone could notice. For the rest of the day, Lily felt light, almost giddy, like she had shared a secret with the world and no one else knew. Marcus found the envelope later that morning. It slipped loose when he lifted one of the bins, fluttering gently to the pavement like a falling leaf. He almost ignored it, assuming it was just another discarded scrap of paper, but something about the pink color caught his eye. He bent down, wiped the sweat from his brow, and picked it up. His name was written carefully across the front, in childish but deliberate letters. He glanced around the empty street, then slipped the envelope into his pocket and continued his route. It wasn't until his shift ended, when he sat alone in the small break room at the sanitation depot, that he finally opened it. The note inside was short, simple, and utterly disarming. For a long moment, Marcus just stared at it, the corners of his mouth twitching with something close to a smile. It had been years since anyone had invited him anywhere. Years since anyone had thought of him at all, beyond the uniform he wore. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, holding it in his calloused hands as if it were made of glass. The next morning, Marcus returned to Bellevue at the usual hour, but this time he slowed when he passed the Hudson house. He glanced up at the large, cold windows, half expecting to see Lily watching from behind the curtains. And there she was, small, blonde, her face pressed against the glass. He lifted his hand in a quiet wave. She beamed in response. That evening, Marcus sat in the small apartment he called home, staring at the envelope once again. He didn't know why he hesitated. Part of him knew how the invitation would be received. Not by Lily, but by her mother, by her neighbors, by all the people who had spent years pretending he didn't exist. But another part of him, one he hadn't listened to in a long time, felt something else. A warmth, a flicker of hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He decided he would go. The day before the party, Bellevue was abuzz with the final preparations. Margaret oversaw every detail, barking orders to the staff as if orchestrating a royal event. The guest list had been finalized weeks ago, and she reviewed it again now, her eyes scanning each name with satisfaction. She had no idea that an uninvited guest had already accepted an invitation her daughter had delivered in secret. In her mind, everything was perfect. The garden had been transformed into a vision of elegance. The dessert table glittered with sugared confections, and the string quartet rehearsed softly in the corner. Her daughter would wear the white dress she had chosen, and the children would behave like little angels under the watchful eyes of their well-dressed parents. Nothing, she believed, could disrupt the image she had so carefully constructed. But the seed Lily had planted was already growing, quietly, beneath the surface of her perfect world. And tomorrow it would bloom in a way no one in Belleview could have predicted. The morning of Lily Hudson's birthday dawned clear and bright, the sky above Belleview washed in the softest shade of blue, with wisps of white clouds lazily drifting past like delicate brushstrokes. The air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass and blooming roses, the perfect spring day that Margaret Hudson had hoped for. The kind of day that seemed hand-picked to reflect her flawless life. Inside the Hudson estate, the house was already alive with motion long before the sun had fully risen. Caterers moved swiftly through the kitchen, balancing trays of miniature pastries and silver platters of finger sandwiches. Decorators wove between tables, adjusting floral arrangements and smoothing pristine linen tablecloths. The string quartet rehearsed quietly in the corner of the backyard, their soft, airy music floating above the murmur of voices and the clatter of preparation. Margaret stood at the center of it all, immaculate as ever in a pale blue dress that matched the sky. She moved through the house like a queen inspecting her court, her eyes sharp, her lips pressed in a line of thin satisfaction as she checked and rechecked every detail. Nothing escaped her notice. The alignment of the chairs, the crispness of the napkins, the symmetry of the balloon arches. Everything had to be perfect. Today was her day as much as it was her daughter's. She had not asked Lily what kind of party she wanted. That had never mattered. What mattered was the impression it would leave, the image of grace, of order, of wealth effortlessly displayed. Today, Bellevue's most prominent families would gather in the Hudson backyard, and they would see once again why Margaret Hudson's name carried weight. Lily, however, moved through the morning in a haze of nerves and uncertainty. She had barely slept the night before, her mind racing with images of Marcus finding her invitation, reading her careful handwriting, deciding whether he would come. She didn't know what she wanted more, that he would arrive or that he wouldn't. Both possibilities made her stomach flutter with a strange mixture of fear and hope. She stood quietly by the window while the adults bustled around her white dress stiff and uncomfortable against her skin. Outside, the backyard had been transformed into something from a magazine. Pastel streamers fluttering in the breeze, glass lanterns hanging from the trees, tables arranged in precise rows. Everything sparkled, everything gleamed, but to Lily it all felt hollow. Guests began to arrive in clusters, mothers and fathers dressed in their finest, children scrubbed and polished like porcelain dolls. The air filled with polite laughter and murmured compliments, the rustle of silk and linen, the scent of expensive perfume. The Hudsons' neighbors, those same people who smiled too widely and spoke too sweetly, filed into the backyard, carrying neatly wrapped gifts and prepared small talk. Lily greeted each guest with a practiced politeness, just as her mother had taught her. She smiled when expected, curtsied when prompted, accepted compliments on her dress with a quiet thank you. But her eyes kept drifting to the gate, her heart skipping each time it creaked or swung open. Margaret hovered nearby, watching her daughter closely. She noticed the way Lily glanced repeatedly toward the entrance, the way her small hands fidgeted at her sides. She assumed it was nerves, the natural anxiety of being the center of attention. She had no idea her daughter's anticipation had nothing to do with the children giggling behind her or the gifts piling up on the table. As the party settled into its rhythm, the children ran across the yard in carefully orchestrated games, their laughter sharp and brittle. The adults clustered in small groups, sipping sparkling water from fluted glasses, exchanging practiced pleasantries. Everywhere there was an air of performance, of people playing their roles in a scene they had rehearsed countless times. But beneath the surface there was something fragile, something false. The conversations were laced with quiet judgment. The cut of someone's dress, the price of someone's shoes, the behavior of someone's child. It was the language of Belleview, polite on the outside but cutting underneath, and Margaret Hudson was fluent. She made her rounds with the ease of someone accustomed to admiration, smiling graciously as neighbors complimented the party, the food, the decor. She accepted their praise as her due, the crown of her carefully constructed kingdom firmly in place. It wasn't long before the whispered comments began, soft enough that no one outside their circle would notice, sharp enough that their meaning was clear. A mother gestured toward one of the waitstaff, murmuring something about people like that. A father laughed quietly at a joke about knowing your place. Another neighbor shook her head when one of the gardeners walked past, muttering about how grateful she was to live in a community that kept things clean. Margaret smiled through it all, adding her own polished remarks, each one a subtle reinforcement of the divide that ran, invisible but unbreakable, through their lives. Lily heard it too, though she didn't understand all the words. She heard the tone, the dismissal, the disdain, and each time it tightened something inside her chest. She glanced again at the gate, wondering if Marcus would really come, if he would walk into this world that pretended he didn't exist. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the lawn. The children gathered around the cake, a towering confection of sugar and fondant shaped like a castle. The parents clapped politely as Lily blew out the candles, her smile tight and strained. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, that the party wasn't really hers. As the afternoon wore on, the chatter of the adults grew louder, the laughter sharper, the edges of their politeness wearing thin. Margaret moved through the crowd like a conductor, ensuring everything remained perfectly composed. She paused occasionally to glance at her daughter, her expression softening just enough to suggest maternal pride, though her thoughts remained firmly fixed on how well everything was going. What she didn't notice was the way Lily's eyes kept drifting, the way her shoulders sagged a little more each time the gate remained closed. By mid-afternoon, the party was in full swing. The children shrieked and ran. The adults sipped wine and gossiped behind carefully cupped hands. And through it all, Lily stood apart, her heart heavy with the weight of something she couldn't name. Margaret noticed her daughter's silence and approached, smoothing a hand over her hair. "What's wrong, darling?" she asked, her voice honeyed. Lily shook her head. "Nothing." Margaret gave her a tight smile. "Try to enjoy yourself. Everyone's here for you." Lily wanted to say that wasn't true. She wanted to tell her mother that the person she wanted most to see wasn't here, that the smiles and compliments felt empty without him. But she bit her tongue, knowing it wouldn't matter. The party continued, the chatter and laughter rising like a tide around her. But inside, Lily felt like she was standing very still, waiting for something only she could see. And then, without warning, the mood shifted. It began with a murmur at the back of the crowd, a ripple of confusion that spread like a wave. Heads turned toward the gate, conversations faltered, laughter faded. Even the children stopped running, sensing the change in the air. Lily followed their gaze, her breath catching in her throat. A black limousine had pulled up outside the gate. its sleek frame gleaming in the sunlight. Behind it, a second car, a luxury sedan, rolled to a stop. The doors opened, and two men in dark suits stepped out, each carrying an enormous, elaborately wrapped gift. The crowd fell silent. Margaret stiffened beside her daughter, her eyes narrowing in confusion and suspicion. She hadn't arranged for any such delivery, and she didn't recognize the vehicles. Whispers spread like wildfire among the guests. Who were they? What were they doing here? The two men moved with the practiced efficiency, carrying the gifts through the gate and setting them gently on the grass. They said nothing, their faces neutral, their movements precise. And then, as the second car door swung open, he appeared. Marcus. But not the Marcus they all knew. Gone was the green sanitation uniform, the gloves, the cap pulled low over his brow. In their place was a perfectly tailored navy suit, crisp white shirt, polished shoes that caught the light. His posture was straight, his steps measured. His face, usually weary and quiet, held a calm confidence that seemed to radiate outward. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The guests stared, their carefully constructed masks slipping as they struggled to make sense of what they were seeing. This was not the man who emptied their trash bins each week. This was not the invisible worker they had ignored for years. Margaret's mouth parted slightly, her brow furrowing in disbelief. Lily's heart soared. She took a step forward, her small hand reaching instinctively for his. He smiled when he saw her, the corners of his eyes crinkling with genuine warmth. The storm had arrived. And though no one in Belleview realized it yet, the winds were about to change forever. The silence that fell over the Hudson backyard in the wake of Marcus's arrival was palpable, almost physical, as if the soft music, the idle chatter, and the rehearsed laughter had been snatched away by an unseen hand. The guests stood frozen, their eyes locked on the man who had just walked through the gate like a ghost stepping out of a forgotten dream. For years they had passed him without a glance, spoken around him as if he were furniture, seen only the reflective strips on his uniform and the sweat on his brow. And now, here he was, standing tall, sharp, dignified, everything they had never bothered to imagine. Margaret Hudson's face remained frozen in a half-smile, but her eyes flickered with something sharp and unsettled. Her fingers, still resting lightly on Lily's shoulder, tightened ever so slightly. For the first time that day, she felt the grip of something she had not anticipated. Loss of control. Lily barely noticed. The moment she saw Marcus, dressed not in the green and gray uniform but in that immaculate navy suit, her heart leapt to her throat. He looked different, like someone from the pages of one of her storybooks, clean and regal and strong, but when he smiled at her it was the same smile she had seen every morning from the window. Gentle, warm, real. Without thinking, she slipped out from under her mother's hand and ran toward him. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the child in her white dress darted across the polished lawn, her curls bouncing in the sunlight, her dress flaring around her knees. She came to a stop in front of Marcus, her breath quick, her eyes bright. "You came?" she whispered, as if they were the only two people in the world. Marcus bent slightly, meeting her gaze. "Of course I did," he said softly. Behind them, the hush began to crack, replaced by the low murmur of whispers and the quick rustle of shifting bodies. The guests glanced at one another, some with confusion, others with suspicion, and many with thinly veiled discomfort. Margaret was already moving, her expression composed but her steps sharp. She reached her daughter's side and rested a hand firmly on her shoulder once more. "Lily," she said, her voice honeyed but tight, "why don't you come back to your guests?" Lily looked up at her mother, then back at Marcus, reluctant to move. Margaret's eyes flicked to Marcus, and for a fraction of a second something cold passed over her face, a glance so quick, so fleeting that only he caught it. Marcus straightened, offering her a polite nod. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Hudson." His voice was calm, measured, lacking any of the subservient tone she expected to hear. Margaret gave him a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good afternoon," she replied coolly. "I wasn't aware you were joining us today." Lily looked up at Marcus, afraid he might turn and leave, but he remained steady. "I was invited," he said simply. Margaret's eyes narrowed, but before she could speak, one of the suited men who had carried in the presents approached, clearing his throat gently. "Excuse me, sir," he said to Marcus. "The gifts are in place." A murmur swept through the crowd again, and all eyes turned to the pile of elaborately wrapped boxes set neatly near the table. Boxes far larger, far more expensive looking than any of the gifts the other guests had brought. Margaret's gaze flickered between the gifts and Marcus, confusion and suspicion tightening the corners of her mouth. "I hope you don't mind," Marcus said, his voice low but carrying. It seemed like an appropriate occasion to bring something special. The words were simple, polite, but they landed heavily in the silence that had settled over the garden. A soft, almost imperceptible shift occurred among the guests, the realization that this man they had dismissed and overlooked, had arrived not empty-handed but bearing gifts grander than any of their own. Margaret forced a brittle smile. "Of course," she said. "How thoughtful." Lily turned to Marcus, her voice small but hopeful. "Will you stay?" He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "If you'd like me to." Lily's face lit up, and she reached out, taking his hand without hesitation. The gesture drew another ripple of whispers from the crowd, but neither she nor Marcus seemed to notice. Margaret's smile had grown strained, her jaw tight beneath the curve of her lips. She turned back toward her guests, smoothing her expression into something resembling grace. "Shall we continue?" she called, her voice light but sharp. The music resumed, the chatter gradually returning like the slow rise of a tide, but the mood had shifted irreversibly. The guests couldn't keep their eyes from flickering back to Marcus, couldn't keep the whispers from slipping past their lips. Lily led Marcus to the table where the children had gathered, introducing him with innocent sincerity, as if there were nothing unusual about a garbage man in a tailored suit attending a party filled with Bellevue's finest. The children, too young to understand the undercurrents rippling around them, accepted him easily. They asked questions about the gifts he had brought, about his suit, about where he had come from. He answered each with patience and warmth, his presence calm, unwavering. The adults watched from a distance, their smiles growing thinner, their glances sharper. The unspoken question hung in the air between them. Who was this man, really? And why had he come here, disrupting their carefully ordered world? Margaret found herself unable to focus, her mind racing as she moved mechanically between her guests. She caught snippets of conversations, questions, speculation, subtle barbs. "Did you see those cars? Where would someone like that get a suit like that? Is this some kind of joke?" She kept her smile fixed, her voice pleasant, but inside, something had begun to unravel. This was not how the day was supposed to go. The party had been meticulously planned, every detail arranged to perfection, and now it was slipping from her grasp, derailed by a man she had never thought twice about. Her eyes found Marcus across the yard, standing with her daughter, speaking to her as if they were equals, as if he belonged. The realization struck her with a force she could not name, a bitter, twisting sensation deep in her chest. As the afternoon wore on, the party continued in form, but not in spirit. The children played, the adults sipped their drinks, the music drifted gently in the background. But the air was taut, charged with something unsaid. And all the while, Marcus remained, moving through the crowd with quiet confidence, unshaken by the glances, the whispers, the thin smiles that followed him. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn, it was clear to everyone present that this birthday party, the one Margaret Hudson had spent weeks perfecting, would not be remembered for the decorations or the cake or the polite conversations. It would be remembered for the moment the invisible man walked through the gate and stood tall among them, uninvited and yet entirely at home. The sunlight had begun its slow descent by the time the hush settled over the Hudson garden once again. Not the startled silence of before, but something heavier, more brittle, a quiet charged with anticipation and the weight of too many questions left unspoken. The party continued to move around the edges, children's laughter ringing faintly, adults murmuring in small, strained clusters, but the heart of the afternoon had shifted irrevocably. Margaret Hudson stood near the refreshment table, one hand resting stiffly on the back of an empty chair, the other loosely holding a champagne flute she had not yet sipped. Her gaze was pinned on the figure across the lawn. Marcus, impeccably dressed, surrounded now by a small circle of guests who had finally abandoned their hushed conjecture in favor of direct inquiry. The tide had turned from whisper to wave. It began innocently enough, a few polite, cautious questions from the bolder parents, half jokes cloaked in civility, the kind of social probing that passed for conversation in Belleview. Marcus met each question with that same quiet, dignified patience, his answers measured, his smile unwavering. But beneath the surface, something more dangerous rippled. Curiosity edged with something else. Suspicion and fear. The first crack came when one of the guests, a tall man in a gray linen suit named Thomas Whitmore, tilted his head thoughtfully and spoke just a little too loudly for the casual tone he attempted to adopt. "You know," he said, glancing around as though sharing an amusing secret, "you look awfully familiar." A murmur stirred. A few heads turned toward him, then back to Marcus. Thomas's wife shifted uneasily at his side, tugging at his sleeve, but he didn't notice. "Forgive me," Thomas continued, smiling thinly. "But have we met before? Outside of, well," his eyes flicked briefly toward the gate, toward the street beyond. "Outside of work?" The words landed heavily in the air, carefully veiled yet unmistakably pointed. Marcus met his gaze evenly. "Perhaps," he replied, voice calm. The silence stretched, taut and expectant. It was another guest, one of the older men lingering at the edge of the group, who finally broke it. "Marcus D. Monroe," he said suddenly, his voice sharp with recognition. The name sliced through the crowd like a knife. Several guests stiffened, exchanging quick glances. Thomas frowned, his brow furrowing as the pieces began to fall into place. "You're joking," someone muttered. The older man shook his head slowly, his eyes narrowing as he studied Marcus more closely. "I remember now," he said, almost to himself. "You were everywhere, years ago. Finance magazines, business journals, Marcus Monroe, CEO of Monroe Capital." A stunned breath rippled outward, catching on lips and frozen expressions. Margaret's fingers tightened around her glass until the stem creaked faintly beneath her grip. Lily, standing nearby, glanced up at Marcus with wide eyes, sensing the shift but not understanding. Marcus's smile did not falter, but it changed. Something softer beneath it now, something tinged with resignation. "I was," he said quietly. "A long time ago." The murmuring began in earnest then, low and urgent, people leaning toward one another, voices sharp with disbelief. "That can't be right. But why? Is it true?" Margaret's mind raced. She knew the name, of course she did. Everyone in Belleview did. Monroe Capital had once been synonymous with success, with prestige, with untouchable wealth. And then, almost overnight, it had vanished from the headlines, replaced by rumors, by vague stories of personal tragedy and disappearance. Her heart beat painfully against her ribs as the implications settled like stones in her stomach. Thomas found his voice again, brittle and incredulous. "But why would you—" he faltered, gesturing helplessly. "Why would you be here?" Marcus let the question hang for a moment before answering, his gaze steady. "Because after I lost everything," he said softly, "I realized I hadn't lost the only thing that mattered." The guest fell quiet, the words hanging in the spring air like a bell's fading chime. He glanced around then, taking in the faces he had seen for years without acknowledgement, without so much as a nod of recognition. "You've all seen me," he continued, voice even, "every week. You passed me on the street. You drove past while I worked. You looked through me." No one spoke. "I used to think," he said, his eyes drifting briefly toward Margaret, "that people only valued what they could measure: money, titles, status. I built my life around that belief, and it cost me everything." A hush fell over the garden. Even the children had grown still, sensing the weight of the moment. Marcus's gaze softened as it fell on Lily. "But then," he said quietly, "a little girl who had every reason to look past me didn't." Lily blinked up at him, her small hand creeping toward his without hesitation. The gesture sent another ripple through the crowd, though no one moved to stop her this time. Margaret felt her throat tighten painfully. Marcus exhaled slowly, looking back at the assembled guests. "I didn't come here today to embarrass anyone," he said. "I came because a child extended kindness without expecting anything in return, something most of us forget how to do." His words fell gently, but their weight was unmistakable. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the spell began to break. Some guests shifted awkwardly, casting glances at one another. A few cleared their throats, murmured polite excuses, drifted away toward the refreshment tables. The facade of the party resumed in fragments, but the air remained charged, brittle beneath the polite veneer. Margaret stood rooted in place, her thoughts a tangle of disbelief, shame, and something sharp and unfamiliar scraping at the edges of her composure. She had spent years teaching Lily the rules of their world: who belonged, who mattered, who could be seen. And now, with terrifying clarity, she realized how blind she had been. Across the lawn, Marcus knelt slightly, speaking quietly to Lily. She smiled, her small face bright and open, untouched by the weight pressing on the adults around her. Margaret swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the champagne flute still clutched in her hand. Everything she had built, the parties, the appearances, the careful control, felt suddenly, crushingly hollow. The music played on. The children laughed again, hesitant at first but slowly gaining momentum as they chased each other across the grass. The parents resumed their conversations, their voices a touch too loud, too bright, as if trying to drown out the echo of what had just been revealed. But something had shifted irrevocably beneath it all. Later, when the last guest had gone and the lanterns in the trees flickered gently in the evening light, Margaret stood at the edge of the garden, staring at the spot where Marcus had stood. Lily approached quietly, her steps light on the grass. "Mommy," she said, her voice soft, "wasn't it a good party?" Margaret looked down at her daughter, something fragile in her gaze. "It was," she said, her voice breaking around the words. "It was the best party we've ever had." But even as she spoke, she knew that what had happened today would not be contained within the neatly trimmed hedges of Belleview. The truth had stepped into their perfect world, and no amount of careful planning would ever send it back. And deep inside, something in her, something rigid and cold and tightly wound, had begun to crack. In the days following the party at the Hudson residence, the quiet streets of Bellevue did not look any different at first glance. The rose bushes remained perfectly trimmed, the lawns perfectly mowed, the pavement washed clean by the meticulous work of those hired to maintain the illusion of effortless perfection. The neighbors still walked their dogs at the same hour, still exchanged polite nods over picket fences, still waved without real warmth as they drove their polished SUVs past one another. But beneath that seamless, painted surface, something had shifted. It began as a whisper, a ripple spreading outward from the heart of the party that had so spectacularly unraveled. Stories traveled fast in Bellevue, always had, but never before had they carried the brittle edge of something real, something undeniable. Every household along the pristine avenue had heard by morning what had happened in the Hudson's backyard, that the man they had dismissed for years as nothing more than the garbage collector had stood before them in an expensive suit, not as a worker, but as a man who once commanded boardrooms and fortune, a man who had seen them all more clearly than they had ever seen him. For many of the neighbors, the revelation arrived not with guilt, but with discomfort, a realization that the unspoken rules they had clung to had fractured in an instant. Conversations over breakfast tables and evening cocktails circled around what they had witnessed, coated in strained curiosity, fragile justification, and the kind of hollow laughter people use to mask the weight of their own blindness. But for Margaret Hudson, the change was not a ripple. It was an earthquake. The night after the party, long after the guests had gone and the caterers had packed away the remnants of the day, she stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the empty space where the cake had been, her reflection fragmented in the glossy marble counter. She could still hear his voice, calm and measured, carrying across the crowd as he told them what they had never thought to ask. She could still see Lily, her small hand wrapped trustingly around his, the child's smile untouched by the discomfort that had gripped every adult in the garden. Margaret had built her life on control, on the sharp, clear lines of belonging and exclusion. She had taught her daughter those lines without ever drawing them explicitly, because in Bellevue one did not have to speak prejudice aloud. It was understood in glances, in silences, in the things left unsaid. But in one afternoon, her daughter had walked across every line Margaret had drawn, without hesitation, without fear. And now those lines would never look the same again. The morning after the party, Margaret found herself standing by the front window, her coffee cooling in her hand, watching as the familiar green garbage truck made its slow, deliberate way down the street. She saw Marcus moving behind it, as he always had, lifting bins, returning them neatly to the curb. No suit, no grand entrance, just the same quiet dignity he had always carried, now impossible to ignore. For the first time, she noticed how the neighbors watched him, too. Some nodded awkwardly now, offering cautious greetings. Others simply stared, their expressions tangled with something like shame. No one, she realized, could look at him the way they had before. The invisibility cloak they had wrapped around him for years had been ripped away, and in its place stood a man they had pretended did not exist. Later that day, Margaret found Lily in the backyard, sitting beneath the old oak tree with her knees drawn to her chest. The girl looked up as her mother approached, her face open and curious. "Mommy," she asked, "are you mad at me?" The question stopped Margaret in her tracks. She crouched beside her daughter, smoothing a stray curl away from her forehead. "No," she said quietly, "I'm not mad." Lily studied her for a moment. "Because I invited Marcus?" Margaret exhaled, the words catching in her throat. "No," she repeated, her voice soft, "because I didn't." Lily blinked, unsure what to make of her mother's answer. Margaret sat down beside her, the spring grass cool beneath her palms. "You taught me something yesterday," she said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Something I should have known a long time ago." Lily rested her head against her mother's arm, content not to press her further. It was not an instant transformation. People like Margaret Hudson did not change overnight. But something had cracked open inside her that day, something she could not close again, no matter how hard she tried. The next week, as the garbage truck pulled up in front of their house, she did something she had never done before. She opened the front door and stepped outside. Marcus looked up surprised as she approached. She could see the flicker of guarded caution in his eyes, the years of practiced invisibility that had taught him what to expect from people like her. She stopped a few steps away, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "I wanted to thank you," she said quietly. He arched a brow, waiting. "For coming to the party," she continued, her voice steady but thin. "For teaching us something we should have seen." Marcus regarded her for a moment, then nodded once. "Wasn't me who taught you," he said simply. And then he smiled, the same smile that had greeted her daughter every morning from behind the bins, and turned back to his work. In the weeks that followed, the changes in Belleview were subtle but undeniable. People began to speak to Marcus when he passed by, not out of pity or obligation, but with the tentative warmth of those who had been forced to confront their own blindness. Some apologized clumsily. Others simply offered a smile, a nod, a greeting that had been withheld for years. The invisible man had become visible. And in the Hudson household, the change ran deeper still. Margaret no longer flinched when Lily spoke about Marcus. She listened. She asked questions. She sat beside her daughter beneath the oak tree in the evenings, her fingers tracing patterns in the grass as Lily talked about kindness, about how sometimes the people everyone else overlooked were the ones who mattered most. And one quiet afternoon, when the sun hung low and golden over the rooftops, she invited Marcus to sit with them. They didn't talk about money, or business empires lost, or the years he had spent walking unnoticed through their streets. They talked about Lily's favorite books, about the way the seasons change the color of the leaves, about small things and real things. Margaret listened, and in that listening, something inside her began to heal. Bellevue would never be perfect. Its lawns would remain trimmed, its houses painted, its residents polished and proud. But beneath that carefully maintained surface, something softer had taken root, a quiet understanding, a recognition of the people they had once refused to see. Lily didn't know the full extent of what had changed. She was too young to understand the weight of prejudice, the brittle scaffolding of social order that had cracked around her birthday party like glass, But she understood one thing. Her simple invitation had mattered. It had reached into hearts closed too long and opened them quietly, without demand or expectation. One evening, as the sky darkened to a soft lavender and the air grew cool, Lily sat beside Marcus beneath the oak tree, her legs swinging over the edge of the garden bench. "You're my friend," she said simply, as if the truth needed no ceremony. Marcus smiled at her, a smile that reached his eyes and lingered there. "You're mine, too," he replied. And in that moment, as the shadows lengthened and the lights of Belleview flickered on one by one, it was clear that something had changed forever, not just in their small corner of the world, but in the quiet, unspoken spaces between people who had learned, at last, to see one another. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. Check out the other videos on the channel for more meaningful stories, and share this video with someone who might need a little reminder about the power of kindness.